This is a production of South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
I had my freedom. When I left Redfield, from the day I left Redfield, January 8, 1974, that's when I got my freedom back. I could truly live free, like Martin Luther King said in August 1963 at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial. Free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last.
The people from Redfield came and there was like a grain truck and it was just full of their stuff. It was chairs and suitcases and that kind of thing, and then maybe each one had a bag with their meds in it.
Those guys were really brave. I mean, to think that, here I am, okay. I've lived here all my life. I'm gonna pack my bags, or have my bags packed for me. And I'm gonna be dropped off in this community, not knowing anything, but I'll do it. It's kind of like going to Mars.
South Dakota has always taken pride in its pioneers. Okay, those people that came from a strange land, that they looked different, they talked different, they ate different food. I mean, my grandparents were Norwegians, and when they came here, they spoke Norwegian. They ate things like lutefisk. People didn't understand that. That was weird. When they came here, the local people didn't want them to be here. They were afraid of them. If you look at what happened with the deinstitutionalization of Redfield, those people were the strange people. They came from a strange land. They talked different. They dressed different. They acted different. And the communities that they went into didn't necessarily want them around either. But they came, and they persevered, and they're as much pioneers as much as my great-grandfather was a pioneer here in South Dakota.
Mark Samus is a Sioux Falls man with a keen sense of history. He can, for example, discuss the space program in depth.
I got interested long before 1961, May 5th, when Alan Shepard made his first flight in space in May 1961. Ever since then, I've been following it.
He discusses his personal history, too, including being institutionalized as a young man in Redfield, South Dakota. Mark often connects his personal history to national events that happen simultaneously.
When I went to Redfield, I went there in October 22nd, 1962, day after President Kennedy made a speech about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The next day, I went to Redfield.
In recent years, he's come to realize his personal story was significant American history in its own right, reflecting how the nation changed its thinking about citizens with intellectual disabilities.
So I went there because I could not keep up in school. That's the only reason I went to Redfield. I found out I was going there before I started 8th grade. When I went there, I was scared. I was absolutely scared still. I was 15 when I went there. I was scared.
The look of the institution didn't help.
Old buildings, and real old, look like they were built in the early 1900s.
They were. Redfield opened its gates in 1902, originally called Northern Hospital for the Insane. The name was misleading because the facility was not built for people with mental illnesses, but would always serve men, women, girls, and boys with intellectual disabilities. In 1913, the name changed to the State School and Home for the Feeble-Minded. In 1951, a few years before it reached its biggest population of nearly 1,200, the name changed again to Redfield State Hospital and School. But some residents had their own name for it.
Lock-up institution to where I had zilch, zero freedom to go anywheres on my own without any staff.
The Redfield campus had housing, school, administration, and staff buildings, its own farm, and even a cemetery. Later in the 20th century, in the Black Hills, a second state facility for South Dakotans with severe intellectual disabilities developed, called Custer State Hospital. If being separated from his family and placed in Redfield was terrifying for Mark as a teenager, it's hard to fathom what it was like for children much younger.
8 years old, and then I had my birthday celebrated when I was 9 years old in Redfield Institution on April 26th.
Yeah, I was born in Watertown, South Dakota, 1946. November 7, 1946. And I went to Redfield, 2 years old.
For much of its history, housing at Redfield was barrack style.
It was a big buildings, on the edge of town. And we went in there, and there were kids of all ages, from babies in the cribs to people who were, older. And we got to visit several wards. And the conditions were appalling to me because there was no semblance of dignity about it. It was just, I hate to use the word warehouse, but that's the way it struck me. And it made an impression on me that just almost haunted me.
They didn't have rooms. You just had 3 rows of beds, 12 beds in a row, side by side. There's no privacy there.
And not much opportunity for being an individual. Personal property often became communal.
I sent a lot of things there for him, for toys and things for him to play with. I never saw them again. I sent lots of articles of clothing, and I never saw them again.
Most everything was done as a group.
That destroyed my self-esteem. Forced me to watch TV, even though it's not on-TV I wanted. Forced me to watch TV.
For younger residents, there was on-site school, emphasizing functional academics and work skills.
My worst subject, I hate it and still hate today, is math or arithmetic. But other subjects I'd like, I did woodworking where I made stuff out of wood.
For decades, it was assumed that any job skills developed would be applied mostly on the Redfield Institution's grounds. There was kitchen work, personal care for other residents, outdoor maintenance, and the farm. Farm produce made up much of the institution's daily menu and was sold off-site too.
I was there when they were killing the pigs. From 6:30 till 8 o'clock, I had to clean up after they got done killing the pigs.
Working in a creamery. Got up at 4 o'clock every morning, take care of 200 gallons of milk every morning.
They had one of the biggest dairy farms in the state. And their cattle at the state fair always will win ribbon after ribbon after ribbon after ribbon.
You would go up there sometimes on the nicest day and you never see anybody outside. From one building to the other, they were moved around in tunnels, partly because it was efficient, so they wouldn't wander off. Partly because you didn't have to put coats on them because it was, that kind of thing. But imagine that. The emphasis was on functionality and making it as easy as they could for the caretaker with not a high rate of sensitivity for the people, the residents that were going through the experience of living there.
Almost everything changed here in the late 20th century. A successful movement to take residents out of the institution and help them build lives in communities across South Dakota was driven primarily by parents who organized informed and aggressive chapters of the Association for Retarded Children.
I hate that word. Absolutely hate that word. When I lived in Peter, there's this building, big sign, Association of Retarded Children. Then, not very long after, Association of Retarded Citizens.
Today, it's hard to find anyone who doesn't hate what they call the R word. The term was degraded by school bullies and other callous users over the years, but it replaced the terms feeble-minded, moron, and imbecile, and was written into state statutes and policies. And the R word adorned the banners and literature of perhaps the most successful parent group ever to take up a cause in South Dakota. Goals included local schooling for children with intellectual disabilities, community employment, and bringing family members home from Redfield. ARC parents mostly faced apathy, but at times also ramifications of horrifying history that shaped neighbors' thinking. Shortly after Redfield's opening, the South Dakota Legislative Manual had described its purpose as
to make this institution a permanent home, not only for feeble-minded boys and girls, but of men and women, with a view of keeping them in such environment and confinement that they will not be likely to marry and reproduce their own unfortunate kind.
South Dakota went a step further, joining a list of states that passed involuntary sterilization laws. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld these laws. 789 South Dakotans would be sterilized, mostly between 1930 and 1960. Victims were usually women at Redfield. At the same time, American pop culture told the public that people with intellectual disabilities were dangerous. Case in point, Nobel Prize winner John Steinbeck created a character, Lenny, in Of Mice and Men, who kills not because of evil intent, but because he doesn't know his own strength. All this added up to inform 2 generations of South Dakotans that there were good reasons for the isolation Redfield ensured, and parents whose children with disabilities were still at home felt their own form of isolation.
In the old days, there was nothing. There was no one would babysit. You didn't have groups of people that would get together and talk about this. Eventually, that did happen. And I suppose that was about the first thing that happened in my life, was a group of women that got together and decided that they would take care of each other's kids while we went to the grocery store. And after that, then education.
The important part here was that we never cured an intellectual disability. And all we did was, with the tools of applied behavior analysis, come up with a method to teach people the functional skills to survive in the community. Residential skills, vocational skills, and they still have their intellectual disability.
In the 1950s, ARC parents were joined in their efforts by remarkable professional advocates.
Dr. Cobb, Dr. Henry Cobb, was the head of the psychology department at the University of South Dakota.
Cobb believed in the mission of ARC parents. He asserted that South Dakota colleges and universities should play roles in preparing professionals who would open doors to community inclusion. In summer 1954, at Julian Hall on the USD campus, he started the state's first training program for teachers and psychologists who would focus on students with intellectual disabilities.
He was instrumental in my being employed at the Redfield State Hospital and School as a psychologist. And during that time, I never lost contact with him and his influence. So I guess a lot of his philosophies motivated me to do the things I did early on to improve conditions there and to start working in the community like I did.
Wally was a unique individual in the sense that he was in a state institution, Redfield, but yet he was wanting to try to find that connection to the community, because he knew, he understood that there were many people in Redfield that could very, very well, should have been served in the community. And so he began to do the most simple things that at the time most people didn't even comprehend.
For example, Wally considered a universal need all people experience regularly, locating a restroom.
But he went around and he marked the bathrooms in the institution with the same markings that you find when you walk into a restroom in the gas stations or a restaurant in the community. So he was beginning to put that little bit of information in front of the people at Redfield, that when they go in the community, this is what they look for, you know? And it seemed so simple at the time. But when you look back, you know, what basic thing would you want to have a person moving from living in an institution for 20 years into the community than knowing how and where the bathroom is?
Meanwhile, Wally's mentor, Dr. Cobb, was never impressed by those prize-winning cows at Redfield. He said,
"One of the greatest days occurred when the superintendent of Redfield Hospital and School had the guts to fire the chief herdsman in charge of Redfield's prize Hereford herd and diverted the resources that were going to cows, the tender, loving treatment of cows, to the care and treatment of humans."
Cobb wouldn't be the last to use cattle imagery in discussing Redfield. Eileen Van Soest, an education major at Northern State College in the mid-1960s, toured the institution and witnessed a section where those with the most profound disabilities lived.
There's a big drain in the middle of the floor, and most of the people who were there didn't have any clothes on, and they were tied with rags to the white pillars with the white wooden benches. And I remember leaving there thinking, oh my goodness, the cows in the dairy barn of my dad's friend were treated better than these human beings.
At the other end of the spectrum were residents with barely discernible disabilities, yet for decades fitting a developmental category that made placement mandatory under the South Dakota Commission for the Control of the Feeble-Minded. Even after the mandate was repealed, community professionals continued to routinely suggest institutionalization.
It always amazed me that the number of admission documents that said, when the family was asked, why are you placing this person at the developmental center, how the responses were often, my doctor or my minister or some other significant person in the community has recommended that we place this person at the institution and just forget about them.
Doctors didn't think that you should bring these kids home. They would tell you if you had a child that had something wrong, just put them in an institution and forget about them, because they'll cause all kinds of problems in your family and so forth. And I think a lot of people did that. They just put their kids away and never saw them again. And that's such a sad thing, I think. These kids, I regard Todd as a gift, truly a gift. And I think a lot of parents missed a lot of things by putting their kids away like that.
There were long-term ramifications to the argument that placement would ensure normal family life for siblings.
For me, growing up with a sister in an institution and kind of knowing in the back of my mind that it was for our sake that she was where she was, that's a pretty heavy burden.
Barb's sister initially was placed in the institution South Dakota opened near Custer in 1963, mostly housing residents who had profound disabilities and were nonverbal. Residents who would haunt the memories of Redfield and Custer staff in coming years were children admitted after suffering brain injuries in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s.
Brain injured children were so often recommended to be institutionalized. The parents were advised to institutionalize if possible. Well, what happened is that there wasn't not a lot of thought at that time about the abilities of the brain to develop. And those who were admitted to the facility were spent a lifetime in the facility. Well, they probably developed pretty well physically and pretty good mentally, but living in an institutional environment without stimulation, they were able to function real well, but they just never had a chance. And so I think that a lot of those that were admitted at an early stage were just not recognized as having the potential that they potentially did have. And we now know.
Discussion of brain injuries made the public uncomfortable. It was a reminder that a car accident or bad fall could put anyone in Redfield.
We had a guy who was brain injured, who had been married, and because of a brain injury was living at Redfield State Hospital, and he remembered he was divorced, of course, but he remembered his married life, and that was a real hard one for him to deal with.
Larry Cass would work hard to move South Dakotans out of the institution and into communities. So would Eileen Van Soest, not scared away by what she saw at Redfield, but instead inspired to make things better.
You know, I would have to give credit to a group of parents who had children with disabilities, who did not listen to doctors at the time when they were told, just put your child in an institution and forget about them and go on with the rest of your life. And they simply said, no, we're not going to do that.
These were Sioux Falls parents in the mid-1950s, 20 years before a law would be written saying schools had to offer education for all children. The parents started their own schools in their homes. As their children grew older, they began thinking about employment options in the city.
They developed a workshop and got a contract from Sioux Steel so that their kids could work. And there were like 11 people with disabilities who, I think it was in 1958, began working, and they were somewhere downtown in the back of some old building. I think it was a bar, I don't even know for sure. You know, I think overall, early on, people were thinking how nice it is and for people to come out of the institution and be closer to their families and that kind of thing. But as far as really accepting them into the community, I'm not sure that happened right away. And it took a while, but I think the best teachers were the people with disabilities who just, they went to the stores and nothing awful happened.
To show you how tough parents had it back in those days, they tried to get the state to come up with some match money for the federal grant that was made available to every state. And if my memory serves me correctly, the grant was not much more than about $30,000. Now, back in those days, that was a fairly hefty sum of money. But they could not even get the state legislature or the state government in '64 to come up with any money.
The parents group, the state ARC chapter, came to the rescue. It had an executive director, and he would serve half-time developing a South Dakota plan, and his salary would serve as match dollars for the federal grant. Establishment of the Office of Developmental Disabilities meant parents could begin seeing the state as a partner in the deinstitutionalization movement. The public seemed especially attuned to the plight of children who, due to multiple disabilities in many cases, were unlikely to thrive in an environment with strict routines and tight schedules.
I don't think that Todd was properly nourished. He was small and he couldn't chew. And when it was time to eat, they would line up for their lunches and they would march in, sit down, and they had a very short time to eat, 20 minutes, I think. And he never finished because he couldn't chew. So consequently, he became malnourished because of that.
Meanwhile, in the late 1960s, Larry Cass went to work for the State Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, finding far-flung jobs for adult Redfield residents on their way out. Larry's service area? The entire state.
I traveled to every nook and cranny. And I traveled with a book of employers in different towns. And I went into a town and I just made it a practical decision that if the company had more than 100 people on their payroll, that there probably was room for at least one or two of my clients.
Averaging 600 to 700 miles per week, Larry worked in the era before community support and residential programs were commonplace.
I still have nervous feelings about when you think about taking somebody out that's never lived by themselves and putting them in an apartment and leaving. But most employers were pretty understanding and would provide a little bit of supervision if they needed it, and the banks took care of the money and they made it.
Bottling plants in the years before automation were common workplaces, as were laundries, nursing homes, hospitals, and cafes. These businesses offered paychecks, of course, and sometimes the only chance for friendship.
That's one of the hardest things is friendship. They just don't, people are leery, were at that time.
Sometimes Redfield staff had to go into the field to help communities understand who these newcomers were.
It wasn't very long. I got a call from the sheriff out there in Fort Pierre and said that there's complaints about this this rancher had hired a person from a mental institution. And so he talked about what the complaints were and so on and so forth, and there seemed like there was some prejudice there too. So anyway, I said, well, let me go out and talk with the ranchers, which I did. And I visited with them, and we have got no further complaints because they didn't understand. And it's all part of the public education that went on in every step and every process.
Meanwhile, back at Redfield, at issue what was declining residential numbers were doing to day-to-day operations.
Well, you know, a lot of residents that were at Redfield State Hospital ran the institution. And actually, they did. I mean, they handled the laundry, the farm, the pork industry, everything, the laundry. And they were very capable and probably should never have been at Redfield.
Barb Avery, whose sister had been institutionalized, grew up to find employment at Redfield. She remembered an institutionalized woman named Esther who worked in a cottage for young residents.
When she left there, I think she didn't know how to handle that because that was her role, was to take care of the little ones. And she no longer had that opportunity. Yeah, we were outside with students. We actually saw her running back saying, I came back to work for you. I came back to work for you. And she was there. And of course she wasn't able to stay. You know, they worked through that process with her. And I have never heard where she went from there or, you know, how she's doing. But she was a phenomenal person who just was very gentle with the little ones and very much cared that they were taken care of and just a very hard worker.
Bonds between residents and with staff were often tight.
The staff were sometimes resistive to having their people leave. It's like having a son or a daughter leave and go off to college or something, and it was difficult for staff, and for many of the folks that left here, it was very difficult for them.
And you hear a lot of stories, and you hear a lot of things that happened there that were very, very not good, very dark. But there also were people there that were very kind, who cared a lot about their jobs, who cared a lot about the people that lived there. You hear stories about people that when they left the institution, it was like leaving their family. The staff were their family.
Most who left Redfield didn't know what they didn't know about the outside world. Vince Braun recalls a man named Al who was very reluctant to leave.
But if I run into Al today, he's going to tear up and say, I didn't know what I didn't know. And he would say it in different words, and thank you for the life I found here. Because he is a person that walks around the community, loves the community, does his own thing, does it in a very appropriate, nice way, and he's just free. And he had no idea that that was even an option for him. So
you can ask people who had been at Redfield, did you have friends there? Most of them say, yes, I had friends. Were there staff there that you liked? And most people say, yes, we have staff that we liked. Were there staff that you didn't like? They would say, yes, there's staff that they didn't like. Do you miss your friends at Redfield? They'll say, yes, they miss their friends at Redfield. If you ever ask them, do you want to go back to Redfield? They all say no. They just have no desire ever to go back.
When I see and followed, particularly some of the people that I knew by their first names up there, because I'd bring some of them out to the farm a couple times, that they had a whole different life, that they had their own room, they had their own friends, they had their own activities, people were paying attention to them.
In the 1970s, amendments to the Social Security Act made it possible for communities to receive federal dollars for building group homes.
My staff was convinced that Johnny was able to be served in that community, but oftentimes we really had to convince that parent, who also rightfully so had been convinced back many years ago that the only place for Johnny was in Redfield. And now we were saying to the parents, no, Johnny can be served in the community.
Sometimes it was very hard for the parents themselves to be advocates for their own children. That's sort of gone away now, but there was a time, and I called it just a realistic denial of reality, like it would go away or something.
You have to stop and think that there's kind of a two-edged sword in that trying to convince, because you don't want to say to the parent, you made a mistake. You know, you made a mistake 20 years ago. Because they didn't, but oftentimes they accepted what we were trying to say as being just that. Oh, you mean we could, 20 years ago, we didn't have to place Johnny in Redfield? But the other thing is, we had to say, okay, yes, we know that Redfield has taken good care of Johnny, but Johnny has got a lot more capabilities than what he's able to gain in Redfield. Give him the chance. And we will protect him. We will protect him. And so that was the struggle back in the, especially in the 70s and even into the 80s.
When we finally made the step in South Dakota with a Senate bill to fund and support community-based alternatives, that really caught on. And it turned out to be kind of an uphill struggle to get communities used to the idea that we're going to do this.
The state established a task force made up of staff from community support organizations, the Office of Developmental Disabilities, and Redfield.
We reviewed very methodically every file of every resident up there, and it took us about a 2-week period. And for each person, we had to come to some consensus of whether or not they were ready to be outplaced, and if so, what if any, special services or supports would they need. And that was, as you might imagine, a little bit touchy politically and psychologically. Imagine being a staff member at Redfield and having these outsiders come in and pass judgment on what you're doing and what you're not doing. And it was really a good bonding experience, believe it or not. And we from the community got to understand way better who's in Redfield and why they're there and what they would need if they came into the community. And the folks at Redfield got to understand what the capabilities of the community were, and we aren't necessarily the enemy.
Organizations that welcomed people who left Redfield built group homes and developed employment ranging from manufacturing in their own workshops to farm life. These organizations were initially called Adjustment Training Centers, and adjustment was a two-way street. Vince Braun remembers first arrivals who came in vans to a farm north of the Black Hills.
It just started slow, but those vans left about 2.5 hours later, and that's when we're sitting in the living room of the home, and we're together now for the foreseeable future. And I don't know much about you, and you don't know anything about me. And so we did start sharing information, and the farm had a cook that was making supper, and it smelled, and she was a great cook. So that kind of took some of the edge off the people, but I can't imagine what it was like for them. Just getting in a van and getting dropped off. And, but that was our start. That was my first memory of that.
There was a certain fashion look to the 1970s, not reflected at Redfield.
You know, lots of people had long hair and, you know, John Lennon glasses and that kind of thing. And these guys did not. They were a throwback to the 40s. And we had some people who wore coveralls, overalls with the zipper up the front. That was what they wore every single day. And to try and change that to, you know, a shirt and a pair of jeans or whatever was difficult in some cases. The other thing we saw was the shoes were steel-toed, and we knew that people had been working in them. They weren't necessarily clean. They only had one pair of shoes. That was it. So it was interesting. And the ladies, I would have to say, the same thing as a throwback to the 40s or 50s, maybe.
Fashions progressed. In most ways, South Dakotans accepted the newcomers, although development of group homes in residential neighborhoods proved a thorny issue in community after community.
So we go and we found a house and we thought this place would be perfect, but we had to get the permit. So we go to the city commission meeting, we walked in and the place is packed to the rafters. And it literally is something out of a movie where the villagers showed up with the pitchforks and the torches, and they were not happy.
It's human nature, I suppose, that sort of the fear of the unknown or the unfamiliar or the thing that don't bother me with other people's problems kind of thing.
And if you look at it, you take a group of people and you put them in an institution and keep them there away from the public is going to start to believe that maybe there is something wrong. Maybe they are dangerous.
So we started our construction because we had the building permits and everything. And then the city did contact us and say, look, we've got neighbors that have found out what's going in and they don't like it. And we said, well, tough.
Neighbors often expressed concern that their property values would likely decline.
That was the surface argument against us moving in. But just below the surface of that argument of the property values going down was the fear that there was something else was going to happen.
We got together with 2 or 3 of them that were the ringleaders, and our executive director at the time basically said, listen, we've got everything set up, we're going. If you cause any trouble, we're going to sue you for the loss of funding and also discrimination, and he had a whole list of things that he was going to say, and they were all legitimate. Anyway, the people kind of just listened, didn't say anything, the meeting ended, and that was the last we heard from that group.
The studies that were done at the Institute for Community Integration at the University of Minnesota for the Minnesota Developmental Disabilities Council has shown that there's been no impact in terms of higher incidences of crime, property values maintain and grow. It's just, people weren't aware.
We just made sure that the house was well maintained, the yard was always mowed, the papers were picked up, and tried to be the best neighbors we possibly could. And we went on, as we built other group homes and other programs, we tried to do the same thing, tried to be good neighbors.
When neighborhood disputes were not resolved, usually something beyond fear was in play: prejudice.
Now, certainly there are, I can remember when we were building group homes, one neighborhood just did not want us there. And so we just decided, you know, we'll go find someplace else because we don't want you as neighbors. Yeah.
Encountering outright prejudice helped Eileen see she was part of a movement broader than deinstitutionalization.
I think it was when I was in graduate school in Nashville, Tennessee in 1971 and 72 that I became more aware of the whole civil rights movement, you know, and because growing up in South Dakota, I mean, you were just kind of isolated, I think, from what was happening across the country, although you hear about it, but really couldn't experience it. And so I remember thinking at the time, what's happening in regard to people with disabilities is really the same kind of thing that's happening in regard to people who are black. And they're being recognized as citizens with the same rights as every other person who's a citizen of the United States. And so I credit, I think, the civil rights movement in letting people who had been on the margins of society for a long time know that, hey, it doesn't always have to be that way. You know, you can exercise your rights.
Eileen traveled to Sweden to see that nation's pioneering efforts in community living and normalization.
And really what the goal was is just to give them the same opportunities anyone else has to experience life.
More than anything, experiencing life meant encountering a wide range of people, from model citizens to creeps. By far, most interactions were positive. Across South Dakota, the newcomers were invited into civic clubs and churches. But on the other hand, there were occasional con artists, uninhibited about relieving a man or woman of hard-earned wages. And there were thoroughly misguided people who believed no one had lived a full life until experiencing deep intoxication on a barroom floor, or maybe visiting a strip club.
He tried convincing me, Carrie Lee, and telling me exactly in these exact words of, there is no sin in for you, Carrie Lee, or anyone and everyone to go to attend strip club dances, lady strip club dances, if it's for the right reasons in God's eyes. But in God's eyes, I say, there is no right reasons.
While Kerry is a strong individual capable of protecting his values and self-respect, his story points to people in communities and decades back in institutions ever alert to opportunities to sexually exploit or degrade victims.
One study suggests that 90% of individuals interviewed experience either sexual abuse or sexual assault. Other studies have said that it's 4 or 5 times what the occurrences in the general population.
There's evidence over the past 20 years suggesting people with intellectual disabilities can learn procedures to reduce the likelihood of this form of abuse. Laws protect them too.
Most states have laws regarding sexual activity with vulnerable adults. And so if you have sexual relationships with a vulnerable adult, that's rape. Okay? Well, intellectual disability is a vulnerable adult.
What's difficult for some people to remember is that men and women with intellectual disabilities may have their own expressions of sexuality.
If you have 2 people with intellectual disabilities who want to have a relationship, are we going to call the police and turn them in for rape? But again, it comes back to saying, no, this is part of life, and that, you know, there are people who have relationships, friends. There are people with intellectual disabilities who are married. There are people with intellectual disabilities who have children. And, you know, that's part of it. And given appropriate supports, things like that can happen.
In the 1970s, South Dakotans became more accustomed to encountering people with intellectual disabilities in their communities, and not only because of deinstitutionalization. Simultaneously, Federal Law 94-142 mandated education in public schools for all children, regardless of disability. Newly minted special education teachers worked with children for whom life in Redfield was unthinkable. In addition to their employment and schooling, some South Dakotans with intellectual disabilities made advocating for rights a second job. Mark Samus served on advocacy boards, including the South Dakota ARC. He reiterated his contempt for the R word, which he believed hurt the ARC organization and individuals.
That stereotypes people. That's what it does. I just don't like that word. It makes people with disabilities second-class citizens, like they need pity. I don't need pity.
Eventually, the state of South Dakota struck the R word from statute and policy. Mark went on to serve with a national organization.
I found I got elected to this national board called Self-Advocates Becoming Power. This was in July 1994. So the 25th anniversary of Apollo 11.
The position took him to Washington, D.C. and other sections of the country.
Goals to work on. Housing, for people with disabilities have affordable housing. Health care, which is a lot in the news now, about the ACA. So that, and the criminal justice system, how people with disabilities should be treated when they get in trouble with the law, and closing institutions. Number one, closing institutions.
Advocating nationally for closing institutions triggered letters to the Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered board from concerned Americans.
They thought we were going to throw people out of the institution, just poof, get up, poof, throw people out, have them close institutions with no place to go, nothing. Just throw them on the streets. No, 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 no.
The letters taught Mark that for much of the American public, talking about closing institutions wasn't enough. People wanted to know the next steps planned for residents who left. He wanted to reply with examples from South Dakota.
A job, a place to live, and where they can get the services they need to make it in the community, in the community. That's what we want. We aren't going to throw them out and put them on your own. Sorry, you're on your own. No, we want to make sure they have everything they need to make it into the community, to be a productive member of the community.
Working to be a productive member of the community. That's what Mark saw falling into place in the 1980s and 1990s in South Dakota, a state with a strong work ethic and sense of community. Custer State Hospital closed completely in the 90s, but actually Redfield never did. Rather, it evolved into something new in terms of philosophy and day-to-day life after its name was changed to the South Dakota Developmental Center in 1989.
I call it a buffer for the community system. When people have difficulties in their lives, when they're living in the community, they need to have a place to go in order to have those issues dealt with. And that's kind of what the Developmental Center has become, is a support for those people that are really having difficulty living in the community.
After challenges are addressed, these short-term residents return to their communities.
Nowadays, everybody has their own bedroom, and there are much smaller areas, 8 to possibly 10 people, sometimes even less than that, live in one living area now. So that's a big change from the earlier years.
There never came a day when service providers said, "Done. We've helped people with intellectual disabilities reach the point where they should be in the 21st century." Rather, by aligning itself with accreditation and research organizations, South Dakota committed to ever-evolving expectations when it came to best practices. Workplaces evolved from sheltered shops comprised only of people with disabilities to integrated shops, followed by a push toward competitive community employment when possible. Group homes are a far cry from institutions, and many South Dakotans still live in them. But the trend today is apartment living throughout communities and even homes purchased by residents.
I can remember when Jan moved into a home that she and 3 other people bought. And Jan had always lived in a group home before, and I can remember her, when I went to visit, she took out her key and she said, "My key, my house." And it was like, you're right, Jan, you get it. You understand the difference between a group home that Suvok owned, and this is your house. Yeah.
The concept called normalization evolved. An example of how it took form has to do with transportation. Community service providers bought fleets of vans and still use many of them. But how normal is it to have vans and paid drivers at your service transporting only you and others with disabilities?
We agreed that we could get rid of 3 of those vehicles and use the local transit authority more. And that's been a good thing.
Good not only for people with disabilities.
It's been a good thing for the transit authority because they have more riders and they have more income as a result. And we have fewer expenses and fewer vehicles to maintain.
But perhaps the biggest change in recent years has been a pulling away from a philosophy where everyone has a responsibility to become, as Mark Samus put it, a productive member of the community. Today, the greater emphasis is on defining life, success, and happiness on your own terms, perhaps the most basic of civil rights. Early in the 21st century, Art Butcher and Steve Dahlman of Hot Springs hit the road, met other South Dakotans with disabilities, and advised them on their civil rights and how to assert themselves in structuring their lives.
A lot of care and respect and everything else, and just try just a little bit harder to try to help your people. We would like to be treated with respect and kindness. Because there's no reason to get mad at people if they don't do anything right. We just tell them we're going to try it again.
You said in your movie, no surprises. You don't want any surprises at your meetings. Did you used to have some surprises?
Yeah.
How did that make you feel?
I mean, I told Mamita I want to take my own cook. I want to have my own money on my account, not on yours, and I want some transportation to go places. You know what? It's working. It's working.
Art and Steve also spoke at universities statewide. So did Mark Samus.
I want to know what it was like living in Redfield or any institution. What it's like have a disability. I always tell them, treat them, because they're usually teachers who are going to work with people with disabilities.
Because if you don't teach them with that, you might as well say, well, you might as well pack up the paper and go home.
You know,
They're not gonna do anything.
like you're saying, this is what I want. This is what, you know, you feel strongly about it, and you want to get something done, so it's important to ask the child as a teacher.
Beginning with Redfield's opening in 1902, it took a century for South Dakotans with intellectual disabilities to move from enforced segregation to leading classes at universities.
But there's another aspect of the culture that's so driven by finances and resources and who has what and who doesn't deserve what, that we could fall back into that really easily, especially if there's some catastrophes that happen that threaten our economy and our way of life.
We cannot, as someone a long time ago who was Department of Human Services head in South Dakota told our board, and I was there, he said, well, maybe we have to go back to regional centers because this is getting too expensive. Well, no, we can't go back there. People with disabilities will not allow it. They will not allow it, and neither will their families.
Indeed, people with disabilities, by becoming part of South Dakota's mainstream, also became the best defenders against moving backward.
Now we've got people in service clubs, you know, in the Lions Club and the Kiwanis Club, and various church communities. We've got folks going to multiple churches around town. They're well accepted. People would know they're not there if they stopped going. And that's a measure of what's really going on. Would people miss them if they weren't there? Yeah, in a lot of ways and by a lot of people.
Community connections mean more than expanded horizons for people living with intellectual disabilities.
You know, there's going to come a time when the paid staff are fewer and fewer, and we need to count on community members to step up. So we're putting a lot of energy into that, getting people out there, getting them to know one another so that those relationships can evolve. And they are.
South Dakota didn't deinstitutionalize because of a court mandate. They deinstitutionalized because the people of the state decided that is something that was a good thing to do. And I think that goes back to the heart of the people of this state.
There is innate in all of us, I think, a hope, a sense of hope. The difficult challenges with commitment, innovation, creative ideas, and then not just talking about them, moving them to action, swimming against the stream sometimes is worth the effort.
People with developmental disabilities don't really have a voice. They haven't really been given a voice in history. And I think it's time that we stop and sit down and listen to what they have to say and take the time and listen to what they're saying and what they want and how they feel about things. I think that is very, very important that we do that.